Thank you all for attending this school. It's going to be a great opportunity to get to know each of you today. So despite Helmut's introduction today, I'm not going to be talking about my particular work or the work I have done as a researcher myself. I'm going to be talking more about this IPBES transformative change assessment. How many of you in the room know what IPBES is? Okay, so many of you. Do you all know the IPCC? Everyone knows IPCC. Okay, so IPBES is kind of like a similar initiative. IPCC is focused on climate change, and IPBES it's a intergovernmental platform in the same way that IPCC, which brings together scientists and policymakers, but the focus of IPBES is on biodiversity and ecosystem services rather than climate change, right? So this IPBES commands or asks scientists to do different assessments, no? Like in the IPCC, it's like, okay, what's the status of the climate change? So we work, or I was working in this assessment on transformative change. This assessment had experts, I think it was like 127 or something around this number, from 42 countries. It had different other assessments that IPBES has done that is more focused on biodiversity, and it brings together a lot of scientists from ecology and the natural sciences. This one had a lot of scientists from social and interdisciplinary sciences, and we have been working for 3 years in the development of this assessment. So this brings together like this 120 scientists. Would you discuss, okay, what's transformative change, what the literature says about what are the pathways for achieving a just and sustainable world. So for 3 years, we kind of like review more than 7,000 references, 400 case studies, 3,000 socio-environmental movements, etc. And then at the end, you put the assessment together. You put like a summary of what do we know about transformative change together. And what you do is that you take it to an assembly with policymakers. So these are kind of like, I didn't have a picture, I should have put a picture, but this is like a meeting of like, I don't know, 1,000 people or maybe 800 or something, no? Like the scientist team that is telling the policymakers what did we found, and the policymakers telling us how to kind of like, whether they could take or not take that. And at the end, the representatives of these policymakers signed this assessment. So we have, what I'm going to be presented to you is not only the findings of 150 kind of like scientists, but it also has been signed by 140 countries, delegates of 140 countries, which form part of this IPBES initiative. So basically, I'm just going to be presenting the main findings of the summary for policymakers. The assessment and the summary are online, so anyone can go and basically check. So now that you know what is IPBES and the transformative change assessment, what we're supposed to do? We were supposed to kind of like assess the literature that it's out there on transformative change. How do we transform our societies to achieve a just and sustainable world? Okay, sounds kind of big. So we basically divide the summary for policymakers in 3 parts. The first part is about explaining or showing the evidence of why transformative change is urgent, necessary, and challenging, but it's also possible. The second one is about the strategies and actions that can be taken to achieve this transformative change. And the last one is about what are the roles of different actors for this transformative change. Okay, part 1, transformative change is urgent, necessary, and difficult, but possible. For those of you who know IPBES in previous work, the first work of the global assessment of the IPBES was trying to look at why there is a loss on biodiversity, why we are losing biodiversity, and there is this decline in nature, right? And the IPBES assessment kind of like look at all these direct drivers. No? There is all this land use change, there is this direct exploitation of organisms, climate change, all this is what they call direct drives, and these affect biodiversity, right? But they also say, okay, but the fact that there is exploitation of nature, that there is climate change, that there is pollution, that there is land use change, all this in itself comes from some indirect drivers, right? There are some social drivers that are moving the fact that we are exploiting nature, et cetera. And these are demographic, economic, conflicts, no? All these drive the fact that there is land use change, et cetera, et cetera. And now in this assessment that we were asked to do, it's like, okay, but why? Why are these indirect drivers kind of like operating? So the finding, or like, I mean, our discourse on that is that there are three main underlying causes that make that societies are moving towards these indirect drivers and the direct drivers, no, and the decline of nature. One is that societies are more and more disconnected, and there is this idea that we should dominate nature, no, and people. So that's the first underlying cause of biodiversity loss. The second one is this idea that societies are growing in concentration of power and wealth, and this concentration eventually acts over these indirect drivers, no? The economic, the institutions, the conflicts. And the third one is that societies are moving to a prioritization of short-term individual and material gains. So basically, these underlying causes are rooted in the social and the cultural patterns, no, where we live, and these influence and reinforce the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So what is transformative change? How can we change this, or how can we challenge these causes of biodiversity loss? So basically in the assessment we define this transformative change as a shift in the views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature decline. So here is we all had to bring a word to discuss, so this is the word that I'm proposing, this is my word. Transformative change is a shift in views, structures, and practices in ways that address the underlying causes, right? This concentration of power, I forgot them, disconnection, and short-term, no? So how do we change the way we are in the world to address those causes? Another finding of this, or another idea on this assessment is that all these changes have to be based in some principles. So it's not only what you do, it's also how you do it, no? You have to do, all these actions have to be based in these ideas of equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human-nature relations, and adaptive learning and action, no? So it's not about only having, I don't know, the reforms of economic system, but you have to do it thinking on justice and equity and justice, pluralism, inclusion, right? So it's not only what action, but how this action is driven by these principles. I'm not going to be talking a lot about that, but one of the chapters of the assessment is about the overarching challenges that have transformative change, and we recognize this idea that transformative change, it's possible, but it's very difficult, right? Because there are all these relations of dominations, there are these economic and political inequalities, there are unfit institutions, unsustainable consumption and production patterns, right? And limited access to clean technologies. So there are all these things and all these power groups that make difficult for transformative change, for a change in views, because there are some power issues behind many of these things. In this first part, one last important thing that I want to emphasize is that the idea of transformative change, when speaking in that way, it seems so big that it seems like, okay, this is never going to happen, right? You have to change the whole world, right? But in the assessment, we may take the stand that both small and large scale changes contribute to transformative change. So it's not only like the governments have to do a reform of the economic system or something like that. It's also how do you engage with others in your daily life, and I'm through the rest of the talk, I'm going to be presenting examples of small scale changes, right, that are transformative because they address these underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature decline. So you can read more about the setting of this idea of transformative change in the assessment itself, and or in the summary for policymakers. I'm going to spend the rest of the second part of the talk talking about what are our findings on strategies and actions for transformative change and on actors. So basically, through our review of the literature, there have been many people and many attempts to move towards a just and sustainable world, right? And we were kind of like trying to see which things have worked or which approaches, with different approaches people have taken. We kind of organize all the different actions that people take in this, what we call 5 strategies. I'm gonna move to this slide because I think it's better. These 5 strategies talk directly to the IPBES conceptual framework about why biodiversity is changing. Oh, there is a pointer here. Okay, they have told me not to move, so I'm just struggling with, but there is a pointer. No. It's very light. It's not working. Okay, so there are 5. We kind of like organize the information that we have in 5 strategies for transformative change. I mean, there is a lot of the conservation community works with conservation in places, right? And the first strategy is to actually emphasize this idea that we should to conserve and regenerate places that are of value for people and nature. So that's the first strategy, and everything that comes within. I'm going to talk more on that now. The second strategy speaks to the direct drivers. So we need to change. We need immediate change in the sectors that are more responsible for the nature declines. The third and fourth strategy talks about transforming or impacting the indirect drivers of nature decline, so by transforming economic and governance systems. And the 5th strategy speaks directly to these underlying causes, how you shift societal views and values to transform the underlying causes of nature decline. So the first one, conserving and regenerating places of value and nature, to nature and people. This is the conservation agenda, right? So the point here, why is this different, or why are we arguing it's different? Because we are arguing it has to be done in a way that embraces the principle of transformative change, right? So it has to be done through including or in collaboration with local communities and indigenous people. It has to be well-resourced, focus on places of value, and recognize the rights of the people, right? So it's not conservation like the protected area, okay, just, no, we decide what to be protected, but it has to be done based on these principles. As an example here, I mean, I'm sure there are many others, many of you can bring other examples, right? But this National Maasai Conservancy in Kenya, which is kind of like based in these values of coexistence, dignity, inclusivity, self-determination, right? So it's a new model of conservation that simultaneously brings together this idea of conservation, but also the values and the cultures of people, right? So that will be the first strategy, promoting this type of initiatives. The second strategy I told you was this driving systemic change in sectors more responsible for biodiversity loss and nature decline. So there is a lot of analysis on what are these specific sectors, which are the ones that directly exploit nature, the fossil fuel sectors, agriculture, forestry, the building of infrastructure, fisheries, mining. All these sectors are the ones that have a direct impact in nature that we can actually see. And there is also a lot of initiative trying to tackle those, right? But on the other side, they are very heavily subsidized by governments, right? So like the agriculture sector, this is a graph of like the subsidies that we have been able to track, the subsidies and externalities generated by these sectors, right? So the thing is that, okay, if governments, rather than subsidizing one type of agriculture, were subsidizing other types of agriculture that are more in line with nature, you will be able to kind of like have a positive impact, And here we have an example of the fisheries reform in New Zealand, right, where this was introducing the sustainability criteria in access to resources, had an impact in how fisheries were done, So the third one is very big, transforming the economic systems for nature and equity. And here is this idea that many of the I mean, this sounds super big, right? So how the dominant economic and financial systems, what do they value, no? And in this graph here, we value, I mean, we see what is the value, like the big arrow is the global GDP, right? And then the second arrow is the global GDP generated by these sectors that are moderately or highly dependent on nature. So that's how much money we are taking from nature. And the last one is the global biodiversity funding, right? So when you look at the landscape of the economics, I mean, where does the money going? And so how can we reorganize that? And then one initiative here that I wanted to highlight is this: can we, as a governments, right, but also scientists, develop frameworks that account for other things than the economic benefits, right? How do we bring other discussions, other values into our environmental indicators, right? It's not GDP. Can we also include other? So we have a review of all these other indicators that try to integrate nature into all these assessments of what is well-being or what is growth. Or, yeah. The fourth one is about transforming governance systems, and also this is kind of like bringing ways in which governance can be more integrated, inclusive, accountable, and adaptive. So it's not so much top-down decision-making, but more bringing all this. Again, this is like a big topic, no? How you actually take decisions, being inclusive and bringing other people. An example here is that how you do community water management, no? Here we have a water management expert, no? You don't recognize yourself. But water governance can be done with a government deciding, okay, we're going to do a canal, irrigation canal here, and that's the way it's going to be. Or it can be done asking people in the irrigation community how this water should be shared and managed, right? So how this builds resilience and can be more equitable. And finally, the last strategy is also in shifting societal views and values to recognize and prioritize fundamental interconnections between humans and nature. And this is about changing social norms, facilitating transformative learning, attending to the pathway school, or weaving with other different, recognizing that there are other forms of knowledge out there, that it's not necessarily science, and etc. No? And for example, the example I have here is to have these education systems in Finland, no? Where that brings or integrates nature connection with the curriculum, no? So I'm just trying to put examples here so it doesn't look so abstract, right? There are many things that can be done for each one of these big things. We did a literature review of 4 million? Someone did it with AI and computer. On looking at how these 5 different actions, and for every action you have for every strategy you have different actions, so how well they were represented in the literature, and the transformation of the economic and governance systems are the ones that are less kind of like predominant in the literature, and the ones that are like, conservation of places are the ones who is more predominant. So you wonder why the focus, no? Where is the focus on the literature, right? And why we are not questioning the governance and the economic systems. Okay, so let me just move to the last part of this. Is like, okay, so we have the actions, but who is responsible for these actions? Who should be taking action on that? And the idea of the transformative changes, I mean, we have this discourse or this idea that there are roles for all, right? Because transformative change is system-wide, no? And therefore it needs this approach that involves everyone in the society, engaging actors and nectors, building coalitions with different sectors, no? So it's not something that only the government should do or only the scientists should do, no? But should be this collaboration. And we basically identify the roles. I mean, we divide many actors in 4 groups. One is the governments, and because also this was an assessment for governments, for the for the policymakers, we also emphasize that governments have a huge role in driving this change, right? Because they can, many of the things I have said, they can enforce by bringing them to policy. They can do regulations that are more strict to benefit natures. They can deploy innovative economic and fiscal tools that can eliminate the subsidies that I was saying before, right? So here there's a little example of the plastic ban in Rwanda. So the government of Rwanda decided to ban plastic bags, right? But this is, I mean, you can have education programs saying, oh, the use of plastic, blah, 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 but if the government bans, it's a much more powerful kind of like tool than some of the others. Civil society has also a critical, super important role in challenging these drivers of biodiversity loss and promoting transformative change. And in the assessment, we actually did a review of about 3,000 mobilizations against activities that threaten nature. And what we wanted to do was to show how these social movements actually have an importance in promoting sustainability. We found that many of these movements are in areas that are very biodiversity hotspots or important, but we also found that they are very repressed. 1/3 of these 3,000 movement, about 1/3 had faced repression. So here, like civil society has a role in kind of like safeguarding nature, but governments could also have civil societies by protecting environmental defenders, right? And one initiative here is this Escazú agreement, that is an agreement that has been adopted in Latin America and the Caribbean to kind of like protect environmental defenders and have transparency and ecological governance. We also, because of the way IPBES is set, that it builds in bringing evidence from multiple knowledge systems, not only science, we also have an important kind of, an emphasis on the role of indigenous people and local communities as agents of transformative change. And here was interesting because when in the dialogues with indigenous scholars or indigenous people who participate in the agreement, they say, but who needs that change? You are just talking as if everyone needs to change, but not all of us need to change. We kind of like, are being changed. We embody sustainable ways of living. We are also resisting already exploitation of harms. We are kind of like defending our rights, and all this is already kind of like transformative in itself, no? So for example, here the example I put is this Birje Jampi concept, no? Is that it comes in the Sami culture, and if I understand it correctly, it's kind of like this idea that you live in nature. I mean, we kind of like, oh, this is a natural resources, we're gonna cut the forest. And for them it's more like, okay, do I need this? No, so it's kind of like embraces the sustainability principle of like how you engage with nature, which is something that in our way of seeing resources is not there, so yeah. And then, of course, the private sector, the point here of the private sector is that they only engage with sustainability when they have pressures from other sectors to do so. It's not something that comes to them naturally because their interest is in the economic gain, right? So the sustainability come when they have pressure. So well-designed policies, pressures from civil society can actually help this sector to move towards more sustainable practices, right? But they need that in general. And then, of course, there is this communication and knowledge sector where most of us are engaged, right? And how can we facilitate this transformative change by changing the narrative, right? So, for example, in this school, it's not about protected areas, right? It's about engaging with equity and justice, how you relate to nature. You can facilitate transformative learning, co-create knowledge, right? So battle disinformation, and I think we have, where's Leticia? I don't know, but she is there. We are going to have a keynote also on disinformation, and I put this example here. So there is also a role in our sector on that. Okay, so I'm 20 seconds from my 25 minutes. So just to let you know that we have developed a practical user guide that it's in the assessment, and you can get the summary for policymakers in this QR code or just by typing summary for policymakers of the assessment. Thank you.